arrived at my husband's funeral expecting one final goodbye, but the moment I walked in, I knew something was terribly wrong. My oldest sister, Carol, was acting strangely, my family avoided me, and the entire atmosphere felt rehearsed. Before the service even began, I was told I couldn't sit with my own family. Have you ever buried the person you loved most, only to realize that someone else had already decided where you no longer belonged? Have you ever walked into a room full of family and felt like everyone knew something you didn't? And what would you do if the people who should have been comforting you had already agreed to shut you out? They never expected to see me again after what they did at the funeral. They thought I'd disappear. They assumed I'd stay silent. None of them imagined I'd come back. The last words my husband ever spoke to me were simple: take care of the family. I promised him I would. Standing outside the church 4 days later, I realized the family was the very thing I needed protection from. I knew something was wrong before I even reached the front doors. My oldest sister, Carol, was standing beneath the church awning, dressed in black from head to toe, carefully adjusting the pearl brooch she'd worn to every important family gathering for years. The moment she noticed me, her expression changed. She leaned toward my brother-in-law, whispered something into his ear, and both of them looked in my direction before quietly turning away. It didn't look like grief. It looked rehearsed. As I walked inside, conversations ended one after another. Smiles disappeared. A few relatives nodded politely, but no one came forward to hug me. It felt less like I was arriving at a funeral, and more like I'd interrupted a private meeting. Near the entrance, I noticed a man I'd never seen before. He wasn't speaking to the minister or greeting guests. Instead, he stood off to one side with a worn leather folder tucked under his arm, while different members of my family approached him one by one. Oddly, he never once looked toward my husband's casket, only toward the people speaking with him. When Carol caught me watching, she calmly stepped between us. She rested one hand on the folder for just a second, offered me a thin smile that never reached her eyes, then guided the man toward a side hallway without saying a single word. That silence unsettled me far more than any explanation could have. Trying to push the feeling aside, I walked into the sanctuary and quietly sat in the front pew where my husband and I had worshipped together for nearly 4 decades. Before I could even settle in, my niece Emily walked down the aisle. For a brief moment, I thought she was coming to sit beside me. Instead, she picked up her purse from the seat next to mine, glanced nervously toward Carol, and moved 3 rows back without saying a word. The empty seat beside me suddenly felt heavier than the grief I was already carrying. That's when I understood this wasn't my imagination. Someone wanted me to feel alone. I barely had time to gather my thoughts before a gentle tap landed on my shoulder. An usher leaned down, his face pale with discomfort. "I'm terribly sorry," he whispered. "I've been asked if you could move." I looked at him, confused. He didn't answer. He simply glanced across the sanctuary. Carol was already watching us. And in that moment, I realized someone had decided I wasn't allowed to sit with my own family. I was publicly removed from the family section and denied the chance to say goodbye to my husband. Carol quietly controlled everything while Emily looked guilty but stayed silent. After the service, I witnessed something that convinced me the funeral wasn't just about grief. It was about protecting a secret. I looked at the usher, waiting for him to smile and tell me there had been a misunderstanding. He never did. "I'm truly sorry," he whispered again. Every eye in the sanctuary seemed to find something else to look at. Slowly, I stood and gathered my purse. The front pew I'd shared with my husband for nearly 40 years was now off limits. Not because it belonged to someone else, but because someone had decided I no longer belonged there. As I stepped into the aisle, I looked toward Carol. She calmly smoothed the sleeve of her black coat before finally meeting my eyes. Then, with a voice so gentle no one else would think twice about it, she said, "Let's not make today any more difficult than it already is." To everyone around us, it sounded compassionate. To me, it felt like a warning. I walked to the back of the church without another word. No one followed. No one objected. No one even looked ashamed. Only Emily. She started to rise from her seat, as if she wanted to come after me. Before she could take a single step, Carol turned her head ever so slightly. Emily froze. A second later, she slowly sat back down, staring at her hands. That tiny moment told me everything. Someone else wanted to do the right thing. They were simply too afraid to do it. The service continued, but I barely heard a word. Then came the minister's final invitation. I'd like to ask the immediate family to come forward for one last private farewell, before we close the casket. My heart leapt. I stood instinctively. I'd promised my husband I would be beside him until the very end. I took one step toward the aisle. The funeral director quietly moved in front of me. His expression was apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I've been given very specific instructions." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he lowered his eyes. "Immediate family only." The word struck harder than anything I'd heard that day. Immediate family. After 38 years of marriage, I was no longer considered family. I watched from where I stood as Carol led everyone to the casket. She rested one hand gently on its polished wood, glanced briefly around the room, and gave the slightest nod. The funeral director closed the lid. That was it. The last chance to say goodbye to my husband disappeared with the sound of a single latch. As people began leaving the sanctuary, I remained where I was, unable to move. Then I heard something that cut even deeper. A woman behind me whispered, "I thought she'd make more of a scene." Another voice quietly answered, "So did Carol." I closed my eyes. They hadn't expected grief. They'd been waiting for a performance. And I'd disappointed them. Outside, people gathered in small groups beneath the church steps. I headed toward the parking lot, wanting nothing more than to leave. Halfway to my car, I glanced back. The unfamiliar man with the worn leather folder emerged from a side entrance. Carol met him beneath an old oak tree, looked over both shoulders, then slipped a small folded note into the folder. He didn't tuck it away. He opened it immediately. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed. He gave Carol one slow nod. For the first time that day, she smiled. Not the polite smile she'd worn all morning. A relieved smile. In that moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had been written on that single piece of paper, it had mattered more to Carol than saying goodbye to my husband. After the funeral, I received something my husband had secretly left for me. Carol almost discovered it, proving she was hiding something, while Emily's guilt became impossible to ignore. Instead of confronting anyone, I decided to find out what Box 214 really was. I stood beside my car long after the parking lot had begun to empty. People drove away in silence, carrying flowers, memories, and grief. I carried questions. For the first time since my husband passed away, I realized that finding the truth mattered just as much as mourning him. Just as I reached for my car door, I heard someone quietly call my name. "Mrs. Parker." I turned to find the funeral director standing a few steps behind me. He looked uncomfortable, as though he'd been debating with himself whether to approach me at all. "I almost forgot," he said softly, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Your husband asked me to make sure this reached you, but only after the service was over." He handed me a small white envelope. Before I could ask him what he meant, he hesitated. For a brief second, it looked as though he wanted to explain something more. Instead, he simply lowered his head and walked back toward the church. I looked down at the envelope. There was no address, no writing, only the familiar way it had been folded. My husband always folded important papers the same way. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a church bulletin from several months earlier. At first, I frowned. Why would he leave me an old bulletin? Then something small slipped into the palm of my hand. A tiny brass key. It couldn't have been more than 2 inches long. One side was worn smooth with age. On the other, a single number had been engraved. 214. I turned the key over again and again, hoping another answer might somehow appear. It never did. Only more questions. Suddenly, I sensed someone nearby. I looked up. Carol was walking directly toward me. Instinctively, I closed my hand around the key and slipped both it and the bulletin back into the envelope just as she reached me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her eyes drifted to the envelope, then back to my face. She smiled. Not warmly, carefully. "You should head home," she said. "You've had enough for one day." There was something unsettling about the way she said it. It didn't sound like concern. It sounded like she wanted me gone. Before I could answer, Emily stepped out of the church. She looked from Carol to me, then to the envelope I was holding. For just a heartbeat, our eyes met. Emily looked as though she wanted to say something. Instead, Carol called her name. Emily flinched. Without a word, she turned and followed Carol to the parking lot. I watched them leave together. One looked confident. The other looked trapped. Only after their car disappeared did I finally climb into mine. The drive home felt strangely different. Earlier that morning, all I wanted was to survive the funeral. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about the little brass key resting inside my purse. It was the first thing my husband had left me since he died. And somehow, I knew he hadn't hidden it without a reason. That evening, I placed the key on my kitchen table beside a cup of tea that had already gone cold. I stared at the number engraved into the metal. 214. It wasn't just a number anymore. It was a promise. Somewhere, there was a lock waiting for this key. And whatever my husband had hidden behind it, Carol was desperate to make sure I never found it. I finally discovered what key 214 opened. Instead of money or valuables, I found proof that my husband had expected betrayal long before he died. That box didn't contain riches. It contained the beginning of the truth. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the little brass key resting on my kitchen table. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. Whatever my husband had wanted me to find, I wasn't going to wait another day. The number engraved on the key, 214, had become impossible to ignore. After a quick breakfast I never really tasted, I drove across town, replaying every conversation we'd had during his final weeks. Had he tried to tell me something? Had I simply failed to understand? Nearly an hour later, I found myself standing inside the same community bank where we'd kept our savings for more than 30 years. The moment I placed the key on the counter, the bank manager looked down at it, then back at me. "You'll need some identification, Mrs. Parker," he said politely. My heart began to race. So, it wasn't a house key. It wasn't for a storage locker. It belonged to a safe deposit box. Box 214. Within minutes, I was escorted into a quiet vault beneath the bank. The manager unlocked the outer security door before stepping back. "The rest is yours," he said. When he left, I was alone. I slid the tiny brass key into the lock. For just a second, I hesitated. Somehow, opening that box felt like saying goodbye to my husband all over again. Then I turned the key. The lock clicked. Inside wasn't a fortune. There was no stack of cash. No jewelry. No hidden teeth. Just 3 carefully arranged items. A sealed envelope with my name written in my husband's handwriting. A small flash drive. And a thick file secured with a blue ribbon. I reached for the envelope first. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line stole the air from my lungs. "If you're reading this, it means I was right to be worried." I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. I took a deep breath and continued. "I don't know when you'll open this box. I only know that if you're here, someone I trusted has already betrayed you." Tears blurred the ink. Not because I was surprised. Because my husband had carried this fear alone. He had known something was wrong, and never wanted me to face it unprepared. The next paragraph was even harder to read. "Please don't confront anyone yet. There are things you don't know. Let the documents speak before you do." I slowly lowered the letter. For the first time since the funeral, I realized I wasn't searching blindly anymore. My husband had already left me a path. With trembling hands, I untied the blue ribbon around the thick file. The very first page wasn't a legal document. It was a family photograph, taken at our 40th wedding anniversary. Every person was smiling. Every person looked happy. My husband had circled only one face. Carol. Beneath the photograph, in his handwriting, were 6 words that made my blood run cold. She wasn't the first to betray us. I stared at those words, unable to breathe. Not me. Us. How long had my husband known? And what had Carol done before any of us ever suspected? At that moment, I understood something that changed everything. The funeral hadn't started this story. It had only revealed the final move in a game Carol had been playing for years. I carefully examined everything inside the safe deposit box. The flash drive confirmed my husband's fears were real, but the evidence showed Carol wasn't acting alone. Then someone unexpectedly reached out, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't facing this alone. I forced myself to look away from the photograph. My husband hadn't circled Carol by accident. He never jumped to conclusions. If he'd singled her out, he had a reason. I carefully placed the picture back inside the file, and picked up the flash drive. For a moment I simply stared at it. It looked so ordinary. The kind of thing you could misplace in a kitchen drawer, and never think about again. Yet somehow, my husband believed it was important enough to lock away before he died. I left the bank, drove straight home, and closed every curtain in the house before turning on my old laptop. For the first time in days, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt necessary. I inserted the flash drive. Only one folder appeared on the screen. Its name was simple: If Anything Happens. A chill ran through me. I clicked it open. Inside were scanned bank records, copies of property documents, insurance papers, and dozens of handwritten notes in my husband's unmistakable handwriting. He hadn't been collecting memories. He'd been collecting evidence. Each document was neatly dated. Each note connected one event to another. My husband had spent nearly 2 years quietly documenting things that hadn't made sense to him. Missing paperwork. Unexpected withdrawals. Conversations that stopped whenever he entered a room. Promises that were never kept. He hadn't accused anyone. He'd simply written one sentence again and again in the margins. Something isn't right. Then I opened the final file. It wasn't a document. It was an audio recording. I pressed play. For several seconds, all I heard was the clinking of coffee cups and distant conversation. Then my husband's voice came through. Calm. Steady. If you're listening to this, sweetheart, then I wasn't imagining it. My eyes filled with tears. It felt as though he was sitting across the table from me. I don't know exactly what's being planned, he continued, but I know someone has been trying to separate us from our finances, one decision at a time. I kept hoping I was wrong. I pray I was. The recording paused briefly. Then he said something that changed everything. I don't believe Carol is acting alone. He said frozen. For days, I'd believed Carol was the entire problem. Now my husband was telling me she was only part of it. Before the recording ended, he offered one final piece of advice. Don't trust what people say after I'm gone. Trust what they did while I was still here. The room fell silent. I replayed that sentence 3 times. Not because I hadn't heard it. Because I suddenly remembered things I'd ignored. Little moments. Old conversations. Appointments Carol insisted on attending with my husband. Documents she always volunteered to organize. Phone calls she ended the moment I entered the room. None of them had seemed important by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern. Just then my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead I answered. Neither of us spoke at first. Then I heard a quiet voice. It was Emily. I can't talk for long, she whispered. Carol thinks you're still too upset to ask questions. She paused, as though checking whether someone was nearby. Then she said the words I'd been waiting to hear. Before I could ask what she meant, she added one more sentence. Meet me tomorrow morning. And whatever you do. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Don't tell anyone we're meeting. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. For the first time since the funeral, someone inside my own family had finally chosen a side. I secretly met Emily, and she finally admitted Carol had been manipulating the family for months. She gave me the first real evidence, and revealed someone else inside the family had played an even bigger role. That's when I realized this battle was only beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the little cafe 20 minutes early. Old habits. My husband used to say it was better to spend 20 minutes waiting than 1 minute apologizing. For a moment, that memory almost made me turn around and go home. Instead I stayed. At exactly 9 o'clock, Emily walked through the front door. She looked nothing like the confident young woman I'd seen at family gatherings. Her eyes were tired. She kept looking over her shoulder before finally sitting across from me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Those were the first words anyone in my family had spoken to me with genuine emotion since my husband died. I should have stopped it. I didn't interrupt. People tell the truth more easily when they aren't rushed. Emily wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, but she never took a sip. "Aunt Carol started changing everything months ago," she said quietly. "At first, none of us questioned it. She said she was only helping Uncle David because he was getting tired." I frowned. "My husband never told me that." Emily nodded. "Because she always made sure you weren't there." A chill ran through me. Emily continued. "She scheduled meetings while you were visiting friends. She offered to organize paperwork. She insisted on driving him to appointments whenever she could." Every sentence matched something I'd found on the flash drive. My husband hadn't imagined any of it. He'd been watching the same pattern Emily was describing. Then Emily reached into her handbag. For a brief second, I thought she might pull out photographs. Instead, she placed a small notebook on the table. "I found this in Uncle David's workshop after everyone left the house." I slowly opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. My husband's handwriting covered nearly every page. Dates, times, names, simple observations. Carol insisted on taking the insurance file. Bank statement missing again. She says she's helping, but nothing feels right. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was documenting facts. That's exactly what he'd done his entire career. When something didn't make sense, he wrote it down. I turned another page. Halfway down, one sentence had been underlined twice. "If anything happens to me, Margaret must see box 214 before anyone else." I stared at the words until they blurred. Even then, my husband had been thinking about protecting me. Emily watched me quietly. "There's something else," she said. Her voice was trembling now. "I heard Carol arguing with someone 2 nights before Uncle David died." I looked up. "Who?" Emily slowly shook her head. "I couldn't see the person." She swallowed hard. "But I remember exactly what Carol said." Emily took a slow breath, then repeated the words she had never forgotten. "If she finds those papers first, everything falls apart." The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Those weren't the words of someone grieving. They were the words of someone trying to protect a plan. I closed the notebook. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily lowered her eyes. "Because I stayed silent at the funeral." Tears rolled down her face. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to get involved. She looked up at me. I was wrong. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You still came." She nodded. "But we're running out of time." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Emily looked toward the cafe window before answering. "Carol doesn't know about the notebook." She paused. "But she knows your husband left something behind." My grip tightened around the notebook. Emily leaned closer. "And she's already trying to find it." At that exact moment, my phone vibrated. One new voicemail. The caller ID made my blood run cold. It was Carol. And the message began with 6 words I never thought I'd hear. "We need to talk about David's letter." I had never told anyone. That David had left me one. Carol realized I knew more than I should. Instead of confronting me directly, she tried to manipulate me into revealing what David had left behind. I kept the truth hidden, only to discover that one important part of David's plan was missing. I didn't return Carol's call. Not that morning. Not that afternoon. In fact, I listened to her voicemail 3 times before deleting it. There was something unsettling about the way she'd said David's name. Not with love. Not even with sadness. With urgency. That alone told me she wanted something. And for the first time since the funeral, I finally had something she didn't. The letter stayed locked inside my desk drawer. The notebook Emily had given me went into my home safe. I trusted Emily. But after everything I'd learned, I wasn't willing to trust chance. Late that afternoon, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the front window, my stomach tightened. Carol. She wasn't dressed in black anymore. Instead, she wore a neatly pressed blue jacket and carried a small basket wrapped in cellophane. Anyone driving past would have thought she'd come to comfort a grieving widow. I opened the door only halfway. "What are you doing here?" Her smile appeared instantly. "I've been worried about you." It was the first time she'd said those words all week. And somehow, they sounded completely empty. "I brought dinner," she said, lifting the basket slightly. "You shouldn't be alone." For years, those words would have softened me. Today, they sounded rehearsed. "I'll be fine," I replied. Neither of us moved. Then Carol sighed, lowering her voice. "Can I come in? We really need to talk." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. Not because I trusted her. Because I wanted to hear what she thought I didn't know. She sat in the living room exactly where David always drank his evening coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her eyes drifted toward my desk. Not toward David's photograph. Not toward the flowers people had sent. Toward the desk. She looked away so quickly most people would never have noticed. I did. "I've been thinking," she finally said. "There may still be some paperwork David forgot to tell us about." Us. Not you. Us. Every word felt carefully chosen. "I've already started going through his things," I answered quietly. Her eyes met mine immediately. Too quickly. "Have you found anything important?" There it was. The real reason she'd come. I forced myself to shrug. Just old photographs and bills. For the first time since she'd arrived, Carol looked disappointed. Only for a second. Then the smile returned. "If you do find anything," she said gently, "you'll let me help you understand it, won't you?" Help. That word almost made me laugh. David had spent 2 years quietly gathering evidence against her. And she was offering to help me understand it. I simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." She stood to leave. Halfway to the front door, she stopped. Without turning around, she asked one final question. "David didn't leave you a letter, did he?" Time seemed to stop. Somehow, she knew a letter existed. I kept my breathing steady. "No." The lie came surprisingly easily. Carol remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then she slowly turned back toward me. She smiled again. But this time, it never reached her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." She walked out without another word. I watched from the window as she climbed into her car. Instead of driving away immediately, she picked up her phone. Within seconds, she was speaking to someone. She nodded twice. Then she left. She hadn't come to comfort me. She had come to confirm something. And I'd just confirmed that she was searching for David's letter. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, I hurried back to the safe deposit box file. There was something bothering me. I untied the blue ribbon again and carefully counted every document. 1, 2, 3, 21. I checked David's handwritten index attached to the inside cover. 22. I counted again. Still 21. One file was missing. Not misplaced. Missing. Someone had removed it long before I ever opened box 214. And judging by the panic in Carol's voice, she was desperately hoping I would never realize it. I discovered David had trusted someone outside the family to protect the truth. That person confirmed Carol wasn't acting alone. And the missing file turned out to be the key to exposing everyone involved. The missing file haunted me all night. I counted the documents 3 more times, hoping I'd somehow made a mistake. I hadn't. David's handwritten index clearly listed 22 files. Only 21 remained. Someone had reached that box before I did. The next morning, I unfolded David's letter again. This time, I forced myself to read every word. Halfway through, one sentence caught my attention. "If anything is missing, don't panic. See Richard before you trust anyone else." Richard? I read the sentence again. No last name. No explanation. Just Richard. At first, the name meant nothing. Then it hit me. Richard Collins. David's closest friend for over 30 years. The man who had helped us buy our first home. The man who never missed a birthday. The man who hadn't attended the funeral because he was recovering from heart surgery. I picked up my phone immediately. Richard answered on the second ring. When I mentioned David's letter, he became very quiet. Finally, he said, "Can you come over? There are some things your husband wanted you to know, but only when you were ready." An hour later, I was sitting in Richard's study. His house looked exactly as I remembered it. Books everywhere. Old family photographs. A chessboard still sitting on the coffee table where he and David had spent countless Saturday afternoons arguing over impossible moves. Richard opened a drawer beside his chair and carefully placed a sealed envelope in front of me. "I've been waiting to give you this." I stared at it. "When David came to see me 6 months ago," Richard said, "he wasn't worried about dying. He was worried about you." The room fell silent. "He told me he believed someone was quietly rearranging his affairs behind his back." I swallowed hard. "Did he tell you who?" Richard nodded slowly. "He had suspicions." He leaned forward. "But David never wanted accusations. He wanted proof." Richard reached for a folder on the table. Inside were copies of emails, appointment dates, and handwritten notes. I helped him organize everything. My heart skipped. "So you knew?" I knew he was building a timeline. Richard looked me straight in the eye. But he wouldn't let me confront anyone. He kept saying the truth would eventually expose itself. I slowly turned another page. Every meeting Carol had arranged. Every unexpected change to financial paperwork. Every unexplained appointment. Everything was listed in chronological order. Then I noticed something. One date had been circled in red. The week before David died. "What happened here?" I asked. Richard's expression changed. "That's the day David called me. He said someone had finally crossed a line." "What line?" Richard took a slow breath. "The missing file." I looked up. "You know about it?" He nodded. "It was the only file David refused to keep inside the deposit box." I frowned. "But it's gone." Richard shook his head. "No. It's exactly where David intended." For a moment I couldn't speak. "If it isn't in box 214. Where is it?" Richard smiled sadly. "That's the one question David made me promise never to answer." I stared at him in disbelief. "He said you'd only be ready when you stopped reacting with grief." And started thinking like he did. Before I could ask another question, Richard handed me a small business card. On the back, David had written 6 words in blue ink. "Follow the timeline, not the people." I read the sentence twice. Then a terrible realization settled over me. I'd spent days watching Carol. Following Carol. Trying to predict Carol. David had been trying to teach me something completely different. The answers weren't hidden inside people. They were hidden inside the sequence of events. Richard stood and walked me to the front door. Just before I stepped outside, he quietly said, "Margaret." I turned. David believed one more person would eventually find the courage to tell you the truth. "Who?" Richard looked toward the street before answering. "I don't know. But when they do, they'll bring you the only document Carol never found." The moment I climbed into my car, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't Carol. It was a calendar reminder I didn't remember creating. Estate review meeting, Friday 10 a.m. Friday was only 2 days away. For the first time since the funeral, I realized that whatever Carol had been planning, it was about to reach its final stage. Emily and I quietly prepared for the estate meeting. Instead of confronting Carol, we let her believe she was still in control. As everything came together, I realized David had planned for this exact moment years before. Friday morning arrived far sooner than I expected. I barely touched my breakfast. The estate meeting had been on the calendar for weeks, but now it felt like something entirely different. It wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the moment David had been preparing me for. Before leaving the house, I called Emily. She answered immediately. "Has Carol said anything?" I asked. Emily sighed. "She keeps telling everyone today's just a formality." A formality. The word stayed with me. People only call something a formality when they already believe they know the outcome. "Is everyone coming?" I asked. "Almost everyone," Emily replied. "Carol made sure of that." Made sure. There was that careful planning again. I thanked Emily and ended the call. Then I looked at the folder David had left behind. For several seconds, I simply rested my hand on it. "I hope I'm doing this the way you wanted," I whispered. For the first time since he'd passed away, I didn't feel alone. I felt guided. Half an hour before the meeting, Emily pulled into my driveway. The moment she stepped inside, she quietly placed a folded document on my dining room table. "I found this hidden inside Uncle David's workshop," she said. It slipped behind one of the drawers. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a deed. It was a handwritten timeline. Every unusual event from the past 2 years had been listed in order. Appointments, phone calls, bank visits, insurance changes. Every entry ended the same way. Witness present. I looked at Emily. He wasn't just keeping records. She nodded. He was making sure someone else could verify every single event. David hadn't trusted memory. He'd trusted evidence. Then something caught my attention. Near the bottom of the final page, one sentence had been underlined 3 times. "Never reveal everything at once." I couldn't help but smile. Even now, David was giving me advice. Emily looked confused. "What is it?" I turned the page toward her. He knew this day would come. Before either of us could say another word, my phone rang. It was Richard. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I just wanted you to remember one thing. I'm listening. Don't try to prove Carol is lying." I frowned. Then what do I do? Let Carol prove it herself. The line went quiet. Then Richard added, "David always believed guilty people talk too much when they think they've already won." After we hung up, Emily looked at me. "What does that mean?" I carefully closed every folder on the table. "It means we're not going there to argue. We're going there to listen." Emily slowly smiled. For the first time since the funeral, I saw hope in her eyes. When we arrived at the attorney's office, several family members were already seated around the conference table. My brother looked nervous. My nephew avoided my eyes. Carol, however, looked completely at ease. She greeted people warmly. She even laughed. The moment she saw me walk through the door, though, her smile faltered. Only for a heartbeat. Then she recovered. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said pleasantly. I returned her smile. "Neither were you." For the first time all week, Carol looked uncertain. As everyone took their seats, I noticed something interesting. Carol kept glancing toward the attorney's briefcase. Not toward me. Not toward Emily. Toward the briefcase. She wasn't worried about what I knew. She was worried about what was inside that case. The attorney cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, "there's one final item Mr. Parker instructed me to address." Carol's confident smile disappeared. She hadn't expected those words. Neither had anyone else. I looked across the table at her. For the very first time, I realized I wasn't the one walking into Carol's trap. Carol had just walked into David's. At the estate meeting, David's final instructions began exposing Carol's deception. I didn't accuse anyone. I let David's evidence speak for itself. One by one, my family realized the woman they had humiliated at the funeral had returned with the truth. The conference room became so quiet that I could hear the attorney turning the pages inside his folder. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Carol stopped smiling. The attorney adjusted his glasses and looked around the table. "Before we discuss Mr. Parker's estate," he said, "I've been instructed to read a personal statement he left for everyone present." I felt my heart begin to race. Carol leaned forward. "So there was a letter," she said, forcing a small laugh. David always did enjoy surprises. The attorney looked at her without smiling. This statement was not placed in the will. It was sealed separately. And I was instructed to read it only if Mrs. Parker attended today's meeting. Every head slowly turned toward me. Carol's face lost what little color it had left. The attorney unfolded a single sheet of paper. Then he began to read. "If Margaret is sitting in this room, it means she found the truth instead of running from it." I lowered my eyes. That sounded exactly like David. "Some of you may believe today's meeting is about dividing my estate. It isn't. It's about protecting the person who stood beside me for 38 years. The room remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one even cleared their throat. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Months before my death, I began documenting decisions that were being made without my knowledge or my wife's. Across the table, Carol shifted in her chair. Only slightly. But I noticed. The attorney continued. I asked people to witness conversations. I kept copies of every important document. I left instructions in different places because I feared not everything would remain where I put it. My brother slowly looked toward Carol. She kept staring at the polished wood of the conference table. The attorney reached into his briefcase. I've also been instructed to distribute these. He began placing identical folders in front of everyone. One for my brother. One for my nephew. One for Emily. One for Carol. One for me. No one opened them. Not yet. You may look inside, the attorney said quietly. The sound of folders opening filled the room. Inside were copies of David's timeline, bank records, appointment logs, witness statements. Every page was dated. Every page matched the evidence I'd already seen. Then my brother spoke, barely above a whisper. I remember this meeting. Emily turned another page. So do I. One by one, family members began recognizing events they'd completely forgotten. Not because David had accused them, because he'd simply recorded what had happened. The truth wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. Across the table, Carol finally opened her folder. She flipped through it quickly, then faster. Suddenly she stopped. Her eyes widened. She turned another page. Nothing. Another. Nothing. She looked up sharply at the attorney. There's something missing. The attorney calmly folded his hands. Yes. Carol's voice became strained. Where is the final report? For a moment, no one seemed to understand why she'd asked that question. Then I did. She knew there had been another document. She hadn't guessed. She knew. Without thinking, she'd revealed herself. The attorney looked at her calmly. Interesting. I don't believe I mentioned a final report. Silence. Absolute silence. Carol's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She realized her mistake at exactly the same moment everyone else did. My brother slowly turned toward her. Carol. How did you know there was another report? No one rescued her. Not this time. Emily quietly pushed back her chair. I asked myself that same question after the funeral. Carol looked desperately around the room, searching for someone. Anyone. Instead, she found only confused faces. The certainty she'd carried since the funeral was gone. For the first time, she looked afraid. I didn't say a single word. I didn't need to. David had done exactly what he'd promised. He had let the evidence speak first. And as I looked around that room, I realized something I never thought I'd experience again. The family that had watched me leave the funeral in silence was now looking at Carol the very same way. Not with trust, with questions. And this time, there was nowhere for her to hide. As the meeting continued, Carol's lies collapsed under the weight of David's evidence. A final witness and the missing report revealed the complete truth. My family finally saw who had manipulated them for years, and I chose dignity instead of revenge. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute. Carol sat perfectly still, staring at the open folder in front of her. The confidence she'd carried into the room had vanished. My brother was the first to break the silence. Answer the question, Carol. His voice wasn't angry. It was confused. How did you know there was another report? Carol looked around the table as though searching for someone to rescue her. There isn't anything to explain, she said. I was only assuming. The attorney quietly shook his head. No. He reached into his briefcase one final time. This is the document Mr. Parker instructed me to keep separate until this exact moment. He placed a sealed envelope in the center of the table. No one reached for it. The attorney opened it himself. Inside was the missing report. David had never placed it in box 214. He had intentionally left it with his attorney. Exactly as planned. The attorney began reading aloud. It wasn't a list of accusations. It was a timeline. A calm, detailed record of decisions Carol had influenced over the previous 2 years. Insurance forms she insisted on handling. Financial meetings she arranged without Margaret. Documents she encouraged David to sign before discussing them at home. Each event included dates, witnesses, copies. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was emotional. Just facts. Then came the final page. At the bottom, in David's handwriting, was a sentence that silenced the room. I do not believe Carol intended to help me. I believe she intended to control what happened after I was gone. No one looked at me. They were all looking at Carol. She finally spoke. I was trying to make things easier. Emily slowly stood. No. Her voice trembled, but she didn't sit back down. You were trying to make everyone believe Aunt Margaret couldn't manage on her own. Carol stared at her in disbelief. Emily. You asked me to stay quiet. Emily's eyes filled with tears. You told me Aunt Margaret was too emotional to handle the paperwork. She swallowed hard. And I believed you. The room grew quiet again. Then my brother lowered his head into his hands. I should have seen it. No one defended Carol anymore. Not because they hated her. Because they couldn't explain away the evidence. The attorney closed the report. Mr. Parker also left one final instruction. Everyone looked up. If any person attempts to influence the administration of my estate through deception, intimidation, or concealment of documents, they are to be removed from all decision-making regarding my affairs. The words landed like a final door closing. Carol's shoulders sank. She understood before anyone else did. She no longer had any authority. No control. No influence. Only consequences. She turned toward me. For the first time since the funeral, there was no confidence in her voice. I never wanted it to end like this. I looked at her quietly, neither angry nor triumphant. You should have thought about that before you decided I wasn't family. Tears filled Carol's eyes. Whether they came from regret or fear, I honestly couldn't tell. As the meeting ended, people slowly gathered their things. My brother stopped beside me. I'm sorry. It was all he could manage. Emily wrapped her arms around me. I'm done being afraid. I hugged her tightly. So am I. As I walked toward the door, the attorney caught up with me. He handed me David's wedding ring. I was asked to return this to you today. My breath caught. I'd thought it had been buried with him. He wanted you to have it, the attorney said. He wrote something else too. I looked at him. The attorney smiled gently. He said, when the truth finally comes out, tell Margaret to go home. She's carried enough. I closed my hand around David's ring. For the first time since the funeral, I felt as though I'd finally said goodbye. I returned home with David's ring and reflected on everything that had happened. My family slowly began to heal while Carol faced the consequences of her choices. I finally understood that the funeral hadn't buried my future. It had buried the lies that had divided us for years. When I unlocked the front door that afternoon, the house was as quiet as it had been every day since David died. But it didn't feel the same. For the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't filled with unanswered questions. It was filled with peace. I placed David's ring on the kitchen table and sat in the chair where he used to read the morning newspaper. Without thinking, I smiled. Not because I wasn't grieving. I always would. But because I no longer carried the weight of wondering whether I'd failed him. I hadn't. I'd simply finished the journey he had started. Over the next few weeks, life slowly found its rhythm again. The attorney completed the estate exactly as David had instructed. Every document was reviewed. Every decision was transparent. No more whispered conversations. No more hidden meetings. The confusion that had surrounded our family began to disappear. One honest conversation at a time. Emily visited often. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat quietly with a pot of coffee and remembered David's terrible jokes that somehow made everyone laugh anyway. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, I almost let fear become the person I was. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The important part isn't when you found your courage. It's that you did. She smiled through tears. I think Uncle David knew you'd say something like that. Months passed. I heard very little about Carol. Some family members chose to keep their distance. Others eventually forgave her. Trust, however, was another matter. Once broken, it doesn't return simply because someone asks for it. It returns only when actions earn it back. Whether Carol ever managed to do that I honestly don't know. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to know. One Saturday morning, I visited David's grave. The flowers I'd planted had begun to bloom. I brushed a few fallen leaves from the headstone and slipped his wedding ring onto the chain I wore around my neck. I kept my promise, I whispered. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For just a moment, it felt as though he were standing beside me again. Not speaking, just smiling. As I turned to leave, I thought back to the day of his funeral. I remembered walking out of that church believing my family had erased me. I remembered thinking I had lost everything. But I hadn't. What I'd really lost was an illusion. The illusion that love can survive without honesty. The illusion that silence protects families. The illusion that sharing blood automatically means sharing loyalty. David's funeral didn't bury my place in the family. It buried the lies that had been hiding inside it. And perhaps that's why they never expected to see me again. They believed grief would keep me silent. They believed humiliation would make me disappear. Instead, I came back carrying something far more powerful than anger. The truth. If this story reminds you of someone you've loved, someone you've lost, or someone who stood by you when no one else would, hold on to them while you still can. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't belong by the very people who should have protected you, remember this. You don't reclaim your dignity by shouting louder than those who hurt you. You reclaim it by refusing to let their lies become your story. Because in the end, truth doesn't always arrive quickly, but when it finally does, it never knocks alone.